Mr. Luba, Andrew, how have you been doing?
I'm actually sick right now, so I am
Oh,
home from
well,
work.
don't die. No, being sick is great because then you don't have to go to work and you can be at the net. Sick is
Exactly.
actually
It's crazy because I think in high school I would have went to school still, but
right.
in today's world I need to be zero symptoms, have
Oh,
zero
oh,
symptoms.
oh, actually, yes. Yeah, it is funny too. Javier, there you are. Everyone, we have to help Javier finish a paper that's due on overwork, anxiety. He's literally got a paper due. And I'm really interested in his video on the grind culture. So I'm going to harass Javier on that and like this culture today where we work all the time and all that and the grind. Because I think it's a fascinating topic. And actually, I think it will tie into the AI topic we've had because there's something weird where now it's almost like an arms race with AI. Because like as AI can do more, you almost have to grind worse to prove that you're not going to get replaced by AI. And that's really weird because for so long, but I'll get into it. But anyway, I want to say congratulations, Mr. Luber, on the first draft of your book. That is marvelous. It's a massive
Thank you.
accomplishment. And where was the what was the channel again where you had the conversation with who? Because that was a really great conversation.
Her name's Karen Wong. She
Yes.
does the meaning code. She's great. I recommend watching all of her videos. They're all very fruitful. It's good stuff. It's funny that with the blue collar job that you had, like that's exactly what because ultimately my job I would say is blue collar, but yet in LA it can't be treated like that because the world is just being strangled by like the scientific paradigm of
Right.
like certainty. We need to be certain that you can't get anyone sick, so we're not liable.
Right.
Like
Oh yeah.
there's all these justifications for this, in my opinion, bullshit. And like it's crazy because when you really think about it, a worldview that's completely grounded by science, like
Mm.
is just it doesn't make sense. Like it's a worldview. You're viewing it. Like it doesn't mean that it is what the world is per se. So it's just I just think it's crazy. It just shows how like worldview and science is just now like one of the same, and that it's just not correct. Like science
Yeah.
does not equal all worldviews. Like that just
No, but this issue you're talking about, well, I think it ties to the grind work and the AI because there's this thing like where they say, well, it's better safe than sorry. Well, actually, no, because very often being safe is being sorry, right? And also, what ends up happening, this is where like like if we talk about virtue ethics, then we were doing another life, the ethics, and like you have to be able in every situation to sort of weigh, okay, is this risk worth taking or not? If you go, if there's any risk, therefore do not do, that's not enough of a guideline, right? And that just goes to show you how you can't outsource your thinking to say a principle like science is good. Okay, no, you have to measure it and purport it with other concerns, right? Like, okay, yeah, sure, maybe there's a 10% chance you're sick and you spread it with other people, but is it really worth creating an entire society that follows a certain order of operation that is going to make anyone who has some degree of making other people sick stay home, right? That doesn't seem like it would be. And also, you would have to unfortunately get a very powerful bureaucratic structure to enforce that, right? And it's going to make a nervousness between people. It makes me think as well, like, so the ability to kind of judge the difference between, say, a real risk or not a real risk, by yourself as individuals, as opposed to outsourcing it to, say, the scientific community or something else, becomes a very important ability. In the same way that it makes me think of Javier's work on work. Like, what's the difference between, like, we have this idea that hard work is good. It's always good to work hard, right? All right, well, now you're in this grind culture that Javier is describing, where you're working like 16-hour days in Silicon Valley because it's good to work hard, right? And you just kind of get sucked into the capitalist machine that's squeezing you like a lemon to get everything it can get. So it's true that hard work is good, but there are contexts in which that can be used in a kind of almost totalitarian sense, right? So likewise, it's good to use science, but then there's another way in which that can be used in problematic ways, right? Because you push it too far, right? So what I think we see increasingly is the problem with outsourcing proportional decision making, if you will, in immediacy or in particular situations to something outside of ourselves, right? And then it becomes really bad because in the same way that if you say question science, you're an idiot or something. Likewise, if you question the, well, wait a minute, maybe this grind culture where you're just working like to grind, there's something problematic with it. Oh, you must be lazy. Oh, you must not want to work hard. You know, there's some sort of similar sort of structure that's an operation there. And everyone's putting really good comments down. And it just makes me think about that. And it really does go to show you as well that if you are not actively thinking, there are external forces that are actively thinking and they will impose themselves upon you. And then you will simply be following them through in different things. And I think you also see, like you're talking here, Luber in LA, and Mr. Javier is talking about the work culture. It does show how, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak, these kind of social forces develop. And then they kind of drag everyone along, even though no one in particular can say what they are. And I think I mentioned, you know, to bring in the Cuban Missile Crisis, I was mentioning last time the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it's so fascinating in Kennedy's book, 13 Days, they all describe the missile crisis like they're caught up in something carrying them along. Like they call it the strength of the terrible something. This like something is tearing you along and you don't want to go there, but nobody knows how to stop going there. Likewise, you have this work culture that's pulling everyone into this like quality of life. Like as I just watched some sort of documentary a few days ago on Silicon Valley or whatever, and just like how the homeless population, the work population, all of these different problems, but then everyone's like, and we don't know how to fix it. But we have to keep doing because we need our, you're just pulled along by the grind culture. You're pulled along by the scientific apparatus. You're pulled along by the game theory dynamics of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then you could even say AI or the Gerardian apocalypse people talk about in different things. And all of this seems to suggest, and then I'll pass it to who wants to speak, all of this seems to suggest the necessity of individuals in their particular circumstancing having the ability to judge proportion, to judge what is the right fitting proportion of scientific consideration with individual consideration, with risk consideration, with virtue consideration. But all of that, and this, Javier, this might be for your paper, all of that though would require what? Facing anxiety. Facing you as an individual subject, making a decision in your circumstance, Kirik, and then you would have to have the courage to be Paul Tillich in that decision that you make, even though it might be wrong. So it seems to me those things go together. That's all to say, Andrew, I hope you don't die. I hope you don't get sick and die. That's all I'm trying to say. I should have written you a card. I didn't. CVS is like 10 minutes down the road. It's really far away. I don't have a horse and buggy. So I hope you don't die. Anyone, whoever.
I'll go. Since I'm the one that brought it up, right? The grind culture. Okay, so I have been trying to rattle my mind. There's several ways to tackle this. I recently just read it today, one of Kierkegaard's essays on anxiety, which proposed a very interesting perspective on grind culture. One of the immediate things that Kierkegaard says is that anxiety roots from the fact that we create the troubles of ourselves. We create the troubles ourselves. And I think this is very similar to what you were saying, Daniel, how there is this notion, it's like, oh yeah, I'm grinding, but I got to do it, right? I got to do it. So there is this notion of like, we kind of create this ourselves because we have to do it. But Kierkegaard says actually the notion of anxiety kind of stems from the idea that we keep looking at tomorrow. And it perfectly made sense, at least in this culture, it makes sense why the whole society is in the framework of tomorrow. And you notice this with ChatGPT. When ChatGPT came out, Google was panicking immediately because they were assuming the loss of their own corporation because of this. So they're already thinking about tomorrow. And so anxiety and the whole AI race is always thinking about tomorrow, right? I got to compete with the next guy, code red, like you said, Daniel. So it seems like the real risk and the false risk that you're alluding to, I think Kierkegaard would frame this that the false risk is the one that's tomorrow, but the real risk is the one that's today. But the thing is, if we're always looking at tomorrow, we can never think about today. So we're not living. And I think this is ironic because grind culture is exactly that. We're not living. And you actually see this in our kind of emotional distress and being like squeezed to death. So there is something to say. I think Kierkegaard is really nailing it on the head, at least when we talk about grind culture. There is something that Tillich says, how it's the threat of non-being that kind of perpetuates anxiety. But with Kierkegaard's understanding, the threat of tomorrow is the threat of non-being, because tomorrow is not yet arrived. So it does make me think how it's always the threat of non-being that sort of perpetuates the notion of anxiety, because even Tillich understands that anxiety has no object. So yeah, I'm kind of stuck there, kind of in that realm of thinking. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
Well, first off, when we talk about grind culture, everyone, we're not talking about the high school dance where you have grinding, okay? We're talking about the work culture. So just, you know, there is a lot of anxiety in grinding at a high school dance. So, you know, there would be an overlay there. I'll pass it to Michelle. There's, so a few things. What's very interesting is it's almost like today, so much of the culture it's almost like non-existence in the social hierarchy. You're afraid that if I don't grind and get the job, then I will not be fittable within a social order and I'll be poor, right? So it's like interesting because there's almost a difference between like Kierkegaard, often there's more of a death, like an emphasis on death. I'm not sure if today, well, there is fear of death, obviously, but it's almost like I'm not going to exist in a manner that will make me able to organize or operate in the society without shame. Like I will always be shameful because, you know, I don't have the cool job or I didn't fit at the top of the ladder or whatever, right? And so there's almost this like, the non-existence as in the loss of the possibility of not operating in the social order in terms of shame, right? But then it would be interesting to think of courage to be as courage to be seen as shameful, to be seen as a failure, to be seen as not doing so well. And then, of course, the counter, and then I'll give it to Michelle, the counter to all this is that, well, no, it's because people are afraid of being poor, right? Like not having money, they want to have a job. And of course, that's a real reality. But what I find very interesting is, in all honesty, like there are so many blue collar jobs that pay so incredibly well, but they're in small towns nobody wants to be seen as living in because they wasted their potential. And you know, and the reason why I bring that up is because why does that thought not even enter most people's heads, right? Especially if they're college, if they've gone to college or they have some like the idea of doing a blue collar job to pay your bills doesn't even enter into people's heads. And they'll say that it has, well, it's about the money and making sure I can have a living, but it's not just that, because if it was, you would go, oh, what am I worried about? Because I can just go paint. Like if you do painting, you know how much money you can make painting houses? Is unbelievable. Plumber. You know how much money plumbers make? There's a shortage of plumbers. But the thought doesn't enter people's heads. And the reason that interests me is because that means there's something like ideology in a Zizekian and Marxist sense going on, right? Where it can't enter. And so what is it, and then I'll pass it to Michelle, what is it about the grind culture that is ideologically significant? Because you can't simply say, in my opinion, you can't say it's simply a matter of economics, of making sure you have money. That's why we're working so hard and grinding, because we want to make the pill. No, you're working hard because you want to fit in a social order in a certain way. Maybe you want to work at this particular company, you want to have this particular job, and there's something else going there. I'm not trying to be a monotheorist and say that the economic explanation has no relevance whatsoever. I'm just interested in the fact that it doesn't even enter people's heads. And that suggests some sort of shame mechanism. But let me give it to Michelle. Michelle, good to see you.
Good to see you all. This is a great topic. So I wanted to say, well, I had a question, but before my question, I want to say that when I think about this concept of grinding, it makes me think of like a mortar and pestle, like to think about not to connect it to middle school dances, but like to think about the mortar and pestle, the actual grinding action. Sorry, the actual action of grinding is what's interesting is it makes me think of like the mortar and pestle or a millstone. Like what's that thing? It's like this wheel that's constantly turning in the same place, quite literally like spinning your wheels. And Daniel and I were talking about this the other day. Like, what's the difference between spinning your wheels in the non-productive sense or spinning your wheels like a car driving somewhere is spinning its wheels too, right? But it's going somewhere. Like so we can't, it's not just that the spinning the wheels is happening. It's that it's not going anywhere. And that's where I think a lot of times people feel like they're not getting anywhere with what they're doing, even though what's strange is that in a sense they should, though, right? Because they're on a track. They're doing like they're going towards their masters, or they have these like, you know, they're doing a job because they have some goal with that, right? Like they're not just making money to feed themselves. They're usually like, I'm saving to be able to do this and do that. And or maybe not. Maybe they're just like, I'm just doing it just to do it because I have to. Otherwise, if I don't, I'm not going to be able to eat. But basically, it just made me think about like this image came to mind of a wheel turning, and like it's literally grinding the ground underneath of it. And so it's just and so it's interesting because like somehow if we like, there's something about this idea of like movement, or maybe it's teleology. I kind of sometimes go in that direction because I think that's helpful, but maybe that could kind of situate the idea of like grinding being still turning, like it's still a type of friction happening there, but it's moving forward or something like that. Or maybe this. Oh, I got it. Nietzsche, yay, the self-propelling wheel. Like it's like the idea of, you know, when water's running through a wheel, it's making energy, right? And there's an action of friction happening, but it's in order to make energy. So it's like, what are you allowing to flow through you? Like we think of it too much in terms of us like gaining distance or getting, never like, you're never, in a way you can never get where you want to, if we think about that like from a Lacanian perspective, but you can like allow stuff to flow through you. So you're still kind of spinning and you're moving, but now you're like allowing the water to flow through you. I think about a lot of like water imagery. I mean, this would connect really well with theology, like living water, being a vessel for God and things like that. But yeah, so I guess I'm just saying like, I don't know, maybe it's about like what are we allowing to flow through us, instead of us just thinking like I gotta be a wheel and I'm still turning and like, can I get there? And you know, it's exhausting. So that's the one thing. I hope, oh yeah, just some thoughts on that. And then my question is, Javier, I really enjoyed your video, and I was wondering what you think the idea of like, how can we maybe process, because your concept in your video was like, sometimes we feel stressed basically and anxious because we don't have enough time to process all the stuff that we're doing. Like there's so much that has to be done. And I think processing is really helpful, and I think it is really great. But I'm like, I wonder, is that just about, and we've talked about this before, right? About like, is it just about having more time? Is it just the time thing? Or is there something about processing that's maybe, I don't know, more ontological? Is it literally about just getting some more time? If you could just get more time, it would fix the situation? Or is it something like, what are possible options for processing? And like, what could that look like, or what may that have a meaning for on a philosophical level? So yeah, I hope that question made sense, but those are my thoughts and no question.
Excellent. And Javier, if you can answer that, you can finish your paper. And all we ask is royalties. You know, if you get an A, we just ask for 10 points of the GPA we all get. You'll end up with an F, but that would be fair. And Emilio, good to see you, sir. I also just wanted to note there's something interesting about grind culture, meaning you always have something to do. And it's almost like a counterfeit of intrinsic motivation where you always have something to do. It's similar, and yet it's entirely different. And it also should be noted that what's tricky here is there's a form of laziness that literally is not working, that is problematic. But then there's a going far where you're literally, the values of hard work are being used to almost like pressure people in certain ways. So those tensions are very interesting, but let me give it to Javier.
Yeah, so immediately I think about, for example, like the healthcare system, at least in America, right? So now that I work as a medical receptionist, right, one of the things that is difficult to deal with is the fact that the way Medicaid is set up is that you have a threshold of income that you have to meet in order to get the Medicaid, right? But the moment you exceed that, even by a little bit, you have nothing, right? Now you have to work even harder. In fact, it's ironic because you actually have less now. You actually have less. And so what happens with that is those people realize that why take that risk really when I can already have that free healthcare? So basically the system already enables them to stay within that paradigm and identify their threshold. And then these are the people that we call lazy. Now, granted, I believe there are certain people that are lazy, 100%. but it doesn't motivate them to get them out of that situation, right? Lazy or smart, right? That is really the question, right? But back to Michelle's question. Yeah, to be honest, I don't know. I mean, I do think there is something Kierkegaard said, like it has to do with like an attitude change. I think it's possible that if I'm always looking ahead, thinking about the Javier failed paper, if I'm looking ahead, that I never actually give myself the time to process. And so, and it's so hard to not think ahead, because when you try not to think ahead, you have people that provoke you to think ahead, right? They're like, wait, so you didn't plan anything. So you're not thinking about your life. You're not caring about your life in any fashion. I think part of my one rebellion really was that I chose a religious studies major, which people would look at as like basically a total L, right? It's a total loss. Why would you pick that job? It has no utility in society. You're going to be poor. Like your status is going to be laughable, basically, because you're probably going to end up working as a plumber anyways. Right? That's, and you know what? I fundamentally am aware of that risk, but it doesn't matter to me. So yeah, I do think, I think it has to do with an attitude change. And then I think there has to be this just moment, this glimmer of a withdrawal. I don't know if it's about necessarily more time, because you can spend more time thinking about the future. So that obviously wouldn't help you. We can sit here all day and just think about, what worries us. But yeah, it has to be an inner change, an inner glimmer of the change of that status quo. I don't know how that would arise, but yeah.
Wonderful. I'm going to pass it to Chetan and Emilio. And there is a need for plumbers who can go over the sumo dentilius. All right. There's that's a market no one is taking advantage of. So like when my plumber comes, I want to hear about the 4 causes. Okay. And how angels are spears. But it's interesting too, because as a note, it's almost like the grind culture is almost like people oppressing themselves in the system as opposed to a top-down thing. That's kind of interesting as a cultural. And then, of course, no one, you don't want to exist in a world where, say, it would be tough to be in a society where there was no infrastructure to make it possible to have internet and computer and all these different things. So you want to have that to work in, but there's something that happens that leads to this social structure of a grind pressure or different things. And then I think it's concerning, because if we end up in an arms race with AI, because it's grinding and all we have is grind culture, then it accelerates to a point where nobody loses. Or maybe AI, we say, there's no hope, so we'll stop grinding maybe. I don't know. Maybe there will be like a forced surrender or something. But let me pass it to Chetan and Emilio. Chetan, good to see you, sir.
Hi. I just sort of was thinking on what you're saying. I think one way to think about these questions is through ideology. The other is through power, isn't it? So the debate between, let's say, Foucault and Althusser, in that sense, that occurred in France. I think one interesting analysis that Foucault gives to this problem is actually that the power becomes more and more non-sovereign in some senses. That's what I think you're saying. That whereas power earlier worked through certain sovereign, links, and it has been becoming more and more non-sovereign. And the concrete sort of description of such a power was, I think, disciplinary power, which later on became biopolitical power. Power which works in indirect ways. So if you think about it, people work, to make people work 8 hours a day, 600, 700 years back. In India, even say 200 years back, you had to use a lot of violence for that. Lot of violence. It wasn't easy in that sense, which is why the violence was very, very high, because the power's nature was very direct. But the corresponding thing was that you only had to work for 4 to 5 hours a day to satisfy that power. The hunger for that power was much lesser in that sense, which was easier to satisfy it. As the power's nature has become more and more indirect, it has become much more difficult to satisfy it, even though violence is not direct upon you. And then the question becomes, what are the indirect modes of coercion? that sort of emerge with this indirect power, such that even when it is much more difficult to satisfy it, we all are in some ways compulsorily trying to satisfy it in that sense. So the first is what is that nature? And Foucault's answer is, of course, this link between knowledge and power. What are the concrete forms of knowledge that sustain such a power dynamic in that sense? That more and more power sort of moves from direct violence, more and more it gets invested in different forms of truth. And what are those truths and how do those truths function? That's one kind of analysis. I think the other thing which I sort of observe when I go and work in the field. So I live in India. Here, blue collar jobs are not paid well at all. I work with slum kids. They don't have almost any means of livelihood other than becoming a plumber, or like even becoming a plumber might be it might be a very good job for them in that sense. And they're not paid well at all. So if you're working in any kind of sort of manly job, working with your hands in some senses, you are at the lower rung of the society. You won't be living in the house like I'm living in. Let's be honest about it. And we are on the other end so spoiled that people like me, I might not know even the smallest things to be done in the house. If somebody else comes into the house and does it, because the wages are so cheap in that sense that we are not used to repairing our own car or painting our own houses or any of that stuff. So the situation is that if you ask them this question, they understand it very well, that the way economy is integrated, even if they're paid less, they know the chances of getting a higher wage later on is much higher, much better if they're working, and I think those are the kind of calculations you're making. You're not making the calculation that how will I survive? Necessity is not the nature through which these decisions are being made. These decisions are being made of certain kind of aspirations, right? Certain forms of desire which are invested in your drives in a particular way, which are sort of functioning through looking at how would I be more integrated in this form of power given, so for instance, I'm regularly told that if you study in the kind of job you get out of academics or degrees in that sense, school degree or college degree, is very different than the kind of job you would get if you do not have a college degree, even if you're paid more in the other jobs, because you know that you won't be as integrated into that mode of power. So people who are actually at the margins, they understand this very well, that they cannot be integrated unless they function through the concrete knowledge practices which are shaping that power. And then the question becomes that, what is the nature of that practical, pragmatic decisions that everyday people make, which decide what kind of negotiations they're going to have with this power in that sense. I think Foucault himself was very idealistic when he thought that his decisions are simply coercive. He of course saw this link between consent and coercion, but I don't think he understood the nature of that consent that exists over there. For him, that consent was automatically coercive in that sense. But that might not be true. If you actually go and work anthropologically on the ground, you'd understand that consent is much more consensual than we give it credit for. People know what is good for them at some level in that sense. It's not always true that it's simply they don't know. It's something more trickier than that, which needs to be thought through when you get through that everyday experience of people around us. And I'm not sure how you think about it.
No, that's a marvelous comment, and I'll pass it to Emilio. A few things. One, I really find it extremely interesting that the more indirect power becomes, the more difficult it is to satisfy. It kind of makes me think that if I were to say, let's today go have a picnic, it's more simple to do that than if I say, let's today have a nice day. What's interesting about the second one is you almost can like pour your energies into seeing what makes it nice. And it's almost like more difficult to have a nice day, precisely because it's unclear what it is, as opposed to the direction, let's have a picnic. Because then you know what to do. Like, that's very direct, but let's have a nice day is indirect. And it's like, why would they say that? Like, what? Am I not having a nice day? Am I making their day bad? And there's this interesting, like, different positioning of the psyche relative to those different instructions. So likewise with power, when power is like, I want you to dig this pit or dig a hole, you're like, oh, precisely the directness of the command kind of limits the power. Because you're like, oh, I know what they want them to do. They want me to dig a hole. Once I dig the hole, power's done with me. But if like power is indirect, where it says, I want you to be a good citizen, You know, you don't know when it's done with you. You know, when you're digging the hole, it's there. When you're eating breakfast, it's there. When you're interacting with your friends, you're there. Because there's always the designation of what would a good citizen do while digging a hole? What would a good citizen do at breakfast? So you can't like escape it. And certainly the point, absolutely. I mean, blue collar, the pay of it is relative to the nation that you're in. And certainly there are other places where blue collar you wouldn't want to have it. What's interesting to me is, I guess, in America, where I'm speaking from, on the notion that in the grind culture, there are options that are relative to the society that don't even enter the consciousness. So then the question exactly is, like, is it that power, like, there's a few things, like, is it because blue collar pays better because power's like, we want to get more competition out of the way, so more people go to those jobs and there are less people in the grind? Is it something where it goes to show you that the grind is actually part of the integration into the power structure that you're afraid of not being integrated in if you go to these different jobs? But then if you're willing not to be integrated into the power structure, you may be compensated with pay because there's not many people who want to do the blue collar in America or different things. So it's interesting to look at all of those different dynamics to kind of get at this question of ideology, power, structure, economics, all of these things. And it does seem to be particular to the nation state or the culture that is in operation. But you're almost not even allowed to think those things because you're supposed to be grinding, dang it. Why are you even having a net conversation? You should be grinding. So there's a mechanism there of making the meta-analysis not even allowed, right? Because if you're doing the meta-analysis, you're not writing your paper, Javier. And so, you know, you're going to fail, Javier, and end up poor in different things. But again, I agree with Ryan. It's a neat market to be a Thomas plumber, but big dollars. You're going to make it rain. Emilio, good to see you, my friend. How are you doing?
Good to see everyone. Unfortunately, my class is about to start, and I'm looking out if my teacher.
We got Javier and Emilio sticking it to the system. They're like, oh,
Yeah, just he's going to like pass this, but just a quick thoughts before I go is that for me it's like laziness when like with the thing that when I jumped up you were talking about, like for me being lazy is good because not because it's a virtue because but the concept of laziness nowadays is almost like if you're doing nothing, if you're just like sitting and watching the clouds, you are really lazy, right? And I'm thinking like it's just like you cannot exist for a moment without doing anything, without thinking or reading. If you are just like existing for a moment and you're lazy, like you should be grinding, you should be working, you should be learning more and fulfilling yourself and deepening yourself. And so like nowadays, like I really struggle with the word lazy because, like, if someone is, for example, depressed and they cannot get out of bed, okay, they're not lazy, they're depressed, right? But, like, lazy in itself is like, it's such a strange concept. You can be irresponsible. You can, maybe you have to pay your taxes, but you're, like, watching at the clouds. Maybe you could be irresponsible, but lazy is like, I don't know what would that even entail, right? Because you're doing what you want to do at that moment. And, like, if you could add other words into the definition, you could say responsible, you could be depressed, etc. But like for me, lazy is almost it's almost like a manipulation word because like they make you feel bad for just existing and having like a nice day of walking slowly instead of rushing into places and stuff.
And so yeah, so that's what I think about laziness. And like with the respect with like blue collar and white collar, I think it's interesting because like most like what the I don't know how to call it, like maybe what they tell us is the market values itself, and like this really neat idea for atrocious things. But if you so like if physical work is valued somewhere, that doesn't mean I think that physical work is more valuable, or vice versa, that knowledge work is more valuable, because I like to think in terms, because I think that generally speaking, we think in terms of market forces, like what's more valuable and like what's more economically valuable or profitable. Funny enough, that's just what it means. It's just like it's more economically valuable. It doesn't mean that it's more valuable per se, like in more inherent sense, because the way like maybe you can get paid a lot, and if you're like a marketer or something, but that doesn't mean your work is inherently valuable. Sometimes it aligns, and like if you're a doctor and you're paid very well, so that's cool. But most things are based like on an economic framework. Like if you produce a lot, you will pay a lot, even if your work is not that valuable or doesn't help that much people, etc. So I don't know, and for me, it's nowadays we have so many options. Like you can go. Like I just moved to Mexico City, and there's like so many things to do. Like I could do a different activity every single day and don't run out of things to do. Like for a year, I could go to a park, I could go to a museum, so many museums. I could stay like a whole week in the anthropologic museum that we have here. And so like you have so many stuff to do, and that's really cool. You expand your reach of like you could say you grow as a human and stuff, but at the end of the day, like if some of the stuff that I could do like fell out, like I found out a place that was like a sushi buffet, and that's like a really cool experience, right? But if I didn't have that in my life, maybe it would still be fine, right? So like if we just like nowadays we have a lot of experiences and they're really cool, and we can value those, but I just think that if we had like the system we have today, but we have like a kind of like floor to just have the like some things that we could agree upon that they're like necessities, like food, water, community, friends, then all the other stuff becomes like a nice game to play. Like, oh, I'm going to earn money so I can go to like this sushi buffet, and it's really a cool experience, right? But you already have like the some of the basic necessities you need. So I think that's yeah, that's stuff that I always keep coming back to. But anyway, my class is really starting right now, so I'm going to go. But it was so lovely seeing you guys. Dude.
Emilio, always a pleasure, sir. Thank you for your revolution against the system by joining the net. It's a good man. Yeah, I was gonna say to him, he said something about sushi not being a necessity, and that's fine. That's fine. But that wasabi and soy sauce, sir, is grand. So it's okay. And it makes me think, and I'll give it to Mr. Luber here, which maybe you want to agree with me that sushi is a necessity for life. I understand, Mr. Luber. It does make me think that it's almost like with grinding, it is true that if you don't grind, you might miss out on something, but you might be fine if you miss out on that thing, but you can't know because you know that grinding may open doors. And if you open those doors, it'll be like, yeah, it was worth it. But it's impossible to experience the world of what you would have had you not done that grinding. So there's some sort of problem there where I guess sunk cost fallacy. I have to think of this. I'm not sure, but there's something there that feeds the problem. But Mr. Luber, please.
The whole notion of grinding, I personally don't like, just because it implies friction. It implies that you're doing something that you're not seeing beyond yourself in the action. You're not in love with what you're doing.
Sure.
So like, there's a sense of being meta in the sense that you're being aware that you're doing something that you like, that you might not necessarily love, that you see an upshot that's worth it, and therefore you grind. Therefore you compress that like into a love. And that's my issue with grinding. And then something with Michelle, what she was saying was with the wheel and seeing the movement in the wheel, for me, it really reflects viewing or having a world paradigm being grounded in parts, seeing things in terms of parts, the perception of something in terms of parts. Because for you to see the movement of the wheel means you're taking into account certain parts of the wheel that is moving. And that's why you're seeing it as moving. You're not seeing the whole thing per se move. You're only seeing just certain sections hitting the floor and moving away from the floor. So to me, that analogy with the wheel, if you see it as something, if it's moving so fast where it's now just still, that's when you're looking at the wheel in terms of the thing itself. In my mind, you're not looking at it. You're not looking at it in terms of a progression, and to talk about what Javier was saying, like with anxiety and looking for tomorrow, it's completely related to that in the sense that if you were looking at tomorrow, in the sense that Kierkegaard talks about, I haven't read him in a while, so forgive me, Javier, if I'm just absolutely fucking him up, but I just got a sense of like, it's not really talking about the relational aspect of the tomorrow into the today, into the past. It's kind of missing the inherent relation that grounds the very fact that you can see it tomorrow. It's only focusing on the juncture of the tomorrow and not the relational part that creates the fact that we're able to see the tomorrow. If that makes sense. But I just think that it's the same thing with, you got to look at the whole picture, and in that sense, you're not going to look at it in terms of what is tomorrow per se. You're going to look at it in terms of what is everything, in a sense. You're going to constantly look at it contingent off of, it's like, it's weird to say, because in English, when you say tomorrow, you're just thinking about tomorrow, but there's no like contingency with that utterance that talks about like the right here, right now, and what happened prior. So because there's no English words for that, it's very tough to sound, it's hard for me to express what I'm saying, I feel like. So yeah, just having like being aware of the contingencies of tomorrow in the very idea of tomorrow is kind of what I'm saying. And then one more thing about, I guess I have a question of the indirect, just clarifying what that means, because in the way you guys are talking about it, it just reminds me of value judgments according to mind independent content versus mind dependent content. And what I mean by that is that, and this is why I want, before I kind of really draw out how it relates, I just kind of want to ask about what you mean exactly by indirect.
That's very nice. I'll give it to Javier and Chetan. Definitely, you would say like the existence of a whole is not contingent upon the thought of the whole being there. So there's a way in which it's not so mind dependent. And it seems, because it's not mind dependent and therefore direct, that it seems more bound. The power, if it says you must dig the hole, it seems more bound. But when it's mind dependent, when the thing being talked about, it's mental. And precisely that lack of that ability to render it into facticity seems to make it more anxiety producing or difficult to stop. So I think it's very fair to bring it to the mind object dependency there. That's a good, for Foucault, if we're talking norms, that power has a lot to do with the normal. Normal is not something you can point at. That's a construct that's going to be more mental. I like Ryan had a nice comment on the wheel. The wheel's quite nice there. And it is interesting too, where grinding, because it's weird, because grinding is not necessarily the doing of work constantly, because you could have, the intrinsically motivated person who's working a lot, but they're not really grinding in the same way. There's some sort of difference in, it's almost like with grinding, it's like, if we just got to get through it, man, and then we're going to get to something. Where the intrinsic motive person is like, no, we're in it. This is what we want. Like the wheel is turning so fast, it is still and stable. It's like a stable wheel, right? And it's centered, so the center is still, but like Ryan's saying, on the edges, it goes everywhere, right? So there's something interesting where it's not the literal amount of time done working. There's some sort of different emotional disposition that's part of it, that seems to have a lot to do with the system. There's a book I read once on like middle schoolers and schooling today, which is just insane. Like these kids staying up doing AP tests, the anxiety, the misery to do well on tests. And it's like, is this really educating people? Is this really the way to go? And that seems to be like grinding, right? And yet, arguably, intrinsically motivated people studying Hegel read just as much as they do, and yet they don't experience it the same way, right? And so that's interesting to me. Mr. Luber.
Sorry, let me just jump in real quick. It reminds me of our conversation we had about the difference between vision, being a visionary, and planning. To me, it's like when you're grinding, you're planning so fucking hard. Like it's like you're uber planning here. Like if it's a vision, if it's a vision in that sense, it's like you're just, I love the term unfolding. You're just letting things unfold, and that unfold sounds so different than grind. It's literally the opposite. Like it's like an opening up that's allowing things to reveal yourself, that like falls into place to your vision, versus just like taking it and grabbing at things like you're shopping. It's like, I am putting this in the shopping cart and I'm gonna make this meal and it's gonna be good. Like it's yeah, it just reminded me of that. Sorry.
That's really good. And Javier, you haven't failed your paper yet. We're finding something. You're not going to fail it. Dimitri, good to see. It's also interesting because it's like the value of work hard does not in of itself, that very value, tell you the difference between grinding and folding, as you were talking about, right? Like that value would not guide you, because in terms of facticity, they're identical. So the value could not help you in the discernment of that difference, even if that value has some application. Dimitri, good to see you, sir. Javier, you haven't failed your paper yet, right? And then Chetan. Good.
No, I haven't failed. So there's a couple of really great things that have been said. So I think the way Andrew approached that vision and planning, I know you guys did that whole thing. Yeah, I think that'd be very close to what Kierkegaard is saying when he talks about focusing on today and not tomorrow. Would be focusing on the vision and not necessarily the planning. But of course, when I was reading Kierkegaard, I was like, it just feels almost impossible not to plan, but then there's a paradox, right? The people that do plan and they always preach about planning, they have an anxiety about tomorrow. That's like the whole predicament about planning. You're planning because you're anxious about tomorrow. But what's ironic about this, and Kierkegaard points at this paradox, is that in order for you to plan well would actually be to be okay with the failure of that planning, that it's going to fail. It might fail. In most cases, it's probably not going to turn out the way you expect it to. And I think that's what Kierkegaard really means when he says that today has its own troubles. And you have to sort of embrace today's own troubles. And part of embracing today's own troubles is the fact that even if you do plan, even if you do assign your own troubles for today by planning, things happen unexpectedly, and you have to sort of just deal with that instead of worrying about the consequences of that being tomorrow. So I think Andrew put that in a nice perspective, and I think that sort of makes sense. Now, Chetan says something really great about indirect power, which is, I think, almost the whole premise of the American dream. Like the very fact that people want to be happy, but being happy, this very pursuit of happiness, is so indirect, so ambiguous, that they're grinding, and you ask them why they want to be grinding, and in reality, it turns out they just want to have a good life, right? That sort of ideology of a good life is such a life-sucking force. It's a life-sucking force that they have a horrible life. And then you run into Viktor Frankl's paradox, where the very pursuit of happiness is miserable. And that happiness is something that sort of is a byproduct of itself. It's not something that you can attain directly. It sort of ensues. It cannot be pursued. And so it seems like there's a lot of this direct approaching to things, having status, having a good life, that they're simply byproducts. They're things that sort of ensue. So it seems like all of the grind culture is predicated on this. But then there's also this idea that we don't know how to fail. And that's also a really big problem. We don't know how to fail. Like, all of culture is sort of predicated on the idea that, well, if you fail, then you can't get what you want. If you don't get the grades in school, you can't go to that big Ivy League school that you want to go to, right? So your dreams are crushed immediately. But then what's even worse is that people don't even know how to deal with the fact that, let's say you lose your legs and now you definitely can't be whatever you wanted to be. And now you have to grapple with that fact, and they don't know how to deal with that. But yeah, I think there's something about what Chetan's saying about exploring like the margins. Like, actually, Derrida talks about this a lot with writing, and writing sort of reveals the structure of language because it sort of has something unintelligible in it, because of like the phonetics can't capture it. It doesn't capture the margins of the spaces between the letters and everything like that. So it seems like what is oppressive about the grind culture is that we're using a capitalist discourse against ourselves or within ourselves to strive for something. And yet I think the aim, or at least I think Derrida would say this would be the aim, would be to explore the margins of that discourse, and aim for a break, a translation, to kind of free ourselves, or actually he talks about inhabiting. It's about a new relation to that inhabiting, even if we can't change it. But still, I'm still like not happy with the status quo. So I don't know, a little bit torn.
Well, and I'll pass it to Chetan. So there's this question now of what does it ensue from? You were saying that like, like it's like, okay, happiness ensues from something. Well, what is that exactly? The other thing that I think is the issue is we did this paper recently on utility as in value. And so basically utilitarianism is a perfectly fine, practically efficient moral system when you're in a lower level of socioeconomic development, okay? Because basically the facticity is like, what will do the most good for the most people? You can look around and say they don't have food, they don't have electricity. Okay, we need to economically develop to do it. But the problem is, as you get more advanced, the effectiveness of utilitarianism as a value structure becomes less and less and less. Like utilitarianism will not tell you how to love your wife. But if all you've ever, you say, oh, I want to do the most good for my wife and therefore love her, well, you have to have the ability to discern how she defines love, right? And if we do like a Gary Chapman love languages or whatever, one person loves gifts, another person likes time together, another person likes doing things. Well, that's not given to you by utilitarianism, just the principle of you ought to do good for them. So then you have to be able to evaluate, which would be more Aristotelian and those kind of things, right? But it seems really hard for societies to get the memo that a transition occurs, or there's a difference between the value system and like Bertrand Russell's problem of leisure, right? Or the problem of how do you determine what you should do for your life when your facticity does not make it obvious? Like if you're in a nation like earlier America and you're like, oh, I should be a farmer because we don't have food. Oh, you know what to do. But if you're like in a modern college today, there's nothing that necessarily screams at you, this needs to be done, right? So then you have to pick it. But how do you pick it? It's not so clear. So then you just grind. So you basically, a lot of the grind culture seems to be to keep your options open. I don't want to have any doors shut. If I'm the top of the class, that means I get to choose, I get to choose what I want to do, right? Because I have the 4.0. But the funny thing is, once you don't know what you want to choose when you get there. So then there's just like the perpetual, because you would have to transition into something more about the ability to evaluate, more Nietzschean, more like value ethics. And there's a transition point here that's very difficult to get. Chetan, please.
Quickly, on the question of indirect form of power. Indirect form of power simply means that its relationship to violence is not direct in that sense. So if I tell you, you work for 5 hours, or I'll hit you, I'll kill you, or whatever, it's a direct form of power in that sense. But if you're functioning 18 hours a day without any direct threat of violence, there's something strange about that. And I'm sure people who lived 500 and 600 years back, would be pretty surprised looking at us living in this house, working 18 hours or 16 hours, 17 hours or 15 hours a day, and thinking, what stupid it is this, You're not even, nobody's threatening you to kill you, nobody's doing anything, and still you're working 18 hours. You actually had to be. So this structure in that sense, which we take for very granted in that sense, wasn't always so. There was a time when people valued their freedoms much more than we do today in that sense. And there has been very structured changes for this to happen, what's happening today. There was a time when people would value their freedom to the point that they would let go of certain securities to actually have that freedom in that sense. So one way to think about it is Hannah Arendt's distinction between violence and power. So Hannah Arendt's distinction violence and power is, and which is very different from Foucault's thinking on power in that sense, not very different, it's opposite of that in that sense. That for Arendt, where there is power, you don't need violence over there. Power creates certain kind of consensus in some senses without the supplement of violence. So as the power decreases, violence, the degree of violence increases in that sense. I think that's how Arendt is thinking about power and violence. So for Arendt, these are questions of violence and not simply power in that sense. For Foucault, it's much more trickier because for Foucault, what Foucault sees over here is not simply this issue of either coercion or consensus. He's seeing some kind of strange mixture that he's trying to point out to us, where power and violence get intermingle to such degrees that it's almost, so the phrase that he uses is that, direct form of power captures the body and disciplinary power captures the soul. sovereign power is out on the body, disciplinary power captures the soul. And the three techniques he sort of gives us for that kind of power to be activated is hierarchies, hierarchical, so immediately when the sovereign starts fading away, you need more hierarchies rather than less hierarchies in that sense. The other thing that he sort of talks about is normalizing judgment. That you need a judgment, a gaze which normalizes, which puts you on norms, which tells you to what degree you're separating from this norm in that sense. So it's not a gaze that is punishing the deviant or the abnormal. It's a gaze that is structuring and creating the abnormal through the normalization. It's a very different thing. One is that we have the spectrum, whoever is outside will be punished. That's one kind of a way of structuring, direct form of power in that sense. The other is that there's a normal, and the more you move away from the normal, the more punishment you'll get. There's a gradation involved now. And how do you find those gradations possible in that sense? And the third essential thing to this is examination. That you need to be constantly examined. It's not an examination that I can read. Yeah, you can't spell. So if you're not examined constantly, that norm doesn't work. That you are being punished as you move away from the norm rather than you being punished when you're more away from a certain spectrum of judgment in that sense. And these are three things that he sort of talks about. If you further think about the structure sort of moves into this problem of some form of externalization. Right? That when we talk about this idea that you outsource your thinking, there is something linked to this problem of Foucault's disciplinary power. That disciplinary power doesn't allow you to think for yourself. It essentially structures you in a manner that you have outsourced the thinking to something else. Isn't it? And this problem of outsourcing of thinking is actually linked to, I think, some form of what Freud would call compulsively acting out. That you are in that sense, and this is where your question of internal motivation comes into picture. That internal motivation is this opposition to this compulsive acting out in that sense, where you're simply repeating without any sort of space for something radically new to emerge. You're repeating what you can't think, as Freud would say, isn't it? That you put in your action that you can't think. So in any psychoanalytic treatment asks you to bring the psychic energy more and more into the attention and thinking apparatus. And the more you bring into that thinking apparatus, more you remember, the less you act out. The more you act out, less thinking, less remembering sort of takes place. This inverse relationship that Freud points out, which is there in a child. When a child is born, he sort of discards his excess energy through motor discharge. He simply moves his hands, legs in that manner, and he feels better. He feels normal. That is what we are doing with our thoughts in some senses. We are simply using our thoughts to act out our excess energy rather than using it for any kind of, And I think these two questions are linked, and I think technology forms the basis for that link to be possible in some senses. And I think we need to think how that structure is coming out to think about. Yeah,
I really like that point. And I'm very sorry that Javier is distracting you with comments and he's just that boy. You're trying to speak and he's commenting. I just want to know, Javier, like if Grammarly does all your spelling, does that mean Grammarly is your tool or that your tool for Grammarly? You have to think about that. I'm not sure. I really like this point that in Arden, like it's almost like violence and power are a little more separate in Foucault, where they come together a little more. That's very nice. And I'm also wondering, where in Foucault, they had the executions in public and they were like, crap, that doesn't work because it inspires heroism. Then they hide him in the prison cell, right? And it's almost like today, now that people know they were hiding him in the prison cell, it's like, crap, we have to put him back in the open. But how do we put them back in the open in a manner that does not lead to revolution? Oh, we'll put him back. We'll make the prisoners be prisoners in a corporation that if you're not you're missing out on status. So it's like bringing the prisoner back to the visual space, because now there's the meta move that people have all read Foucault and they know you keep the prisoner hidden so that they don't inspire heroism. So it's like, okay, you have to move them back into the public space, but in a manner that actually contributes to the power structure in the compulsionary action. Because you see all the prisoners, they're then like, hey, why aren't you working more? So and it's almost like it's almost like when the prisoner was executed for breaking a crime, you had a reason for not being like that person because you didn't want to break a crime, right? Or you don't want to break the law. Break a crime, that's a phrase. Break the law. But now, since you can be like the prisoner, you have no excuse for not being like the prisoner, right? And participating in that heroism. And the heroicism just happens to be what feeds the grind culture, right? So I wonder if there's like a third step in a Foucaultian analysis of the like bringing the prisoner back into the public sphere, but now seeing them inspires you to be like that prisoner. But what the prisoner is doing is the grind culture. And obviously I'm using prisoner more metaphorically, but it feels like you're a prisoner because the image I have now is I have the like every time I see two robins sitting on a tree limb singing, looking at modern man instead of prehistoric man, I'm going to hear them saying idiots, 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 idiots. That's all the birds sing all day long. They're like idiots. Idiots. And there's something about there where, like you're saying, like modern man versus prehistoric man is very like imprisoned, but not by something direct. So there is a sense in which you're a prisoner, but it's a visual imprisonment that actually leads to everyone doing it, right? But then it would require facing the crowd, Kierkegaard anxiety not to fall into that structure. So I will always hear birds now singing idiots, idiots, idiots. Look at these guys, they're really dumb. Anyway, Javier, have you failed your paper?
No, I'm good.
Good.
So actually, Kierkegaard actually uses a bird to make his example on anxiety. He's like, birds aren't anxious. Why is man anxious? But actually, I have a question for Chetan. And I think this is because I know Foucault is typically associated with the postmodern movement, but I feel like when you said we're more susceptible to acting out if we're not thinking. And it makes me feel like how I keep saying like postmodernism was really good at debunking bad epistemology, but I feel like they kind of left us out in the cold to where now we're just having anxiety about thinking, which inadvertently attracts us to indirect power. And I wonder if that assessment is kind of correct or not. I'm just curious, like, what you think.
I think Foucault had a very interesting phrase somewhere. Somebody wrote about Foucault. I don't exactly remember. I think Foucault wrote somewhere and somebody sort of picked it up from there. That Foucault wanted to purge us of our addiction to truth. And I think that's where I think its postmodernist streak should come forward in that sense, that he called us a society who's addicted to truth in that sense. He saw an addiction to our, and if you see Freudian thinking on neurosis, especially obsessional neurosis, it's something around that lines where when Lacan says it very famously that, that jealousy of the husband is still pathological even if the wife is cheating. Remember? So the idea being that, that the truth of the wife cheating doesn't actually absolve the patient from his own pathological jealousy. And the more obsessed you are with that truth that your wife is cheating, the more ill you're going to get. Right? Because the more you will not be able to focus upon your own jealousy, the more the focus is upon the truth of the wife in that sense. So Foucault had something similar in that line, where Foucault saw it as a culture who's gotten obsessed with truth, who's addicted to truth. And he was sort of trying to find a way through which he could show you that how power is functioning. And that is only possible once you get de-addicted to this consumption of truth. Isn't it? Beyond this, I think question of, say, something like postmodern, I'm sure that word has a meaning today. I'm not sure what it is, to be honest to you. In some senses, it has become this this pejorative term which sort of tries to club many different philosophical movements together, whether it's Derrida, Foucault, even Lyotard, who sort of himself said, that he's a postmodernist. But postmodernism as such, as a form of thinking on one side, has, I think, slipped into this idea that there are multiple truths, there is no truth, that kind of, which without having any concrete basis to what do we do with truth. On the other side, it has gotten linked to post-structuralism in forms that we need to shift away from certain established epistemological, as you rightly said, hierarchies and find new epistemological hierarchies. Depending on which point you choose to define your postmodern spectrum, you would get different kinds of answers to that. No, I think it's a word that we have overused at some, at some point certain words get overused. I think it's a word that we've overused to speak about the world in some sense. I'm not sure how others would look at it, how even you in that sense.
No, I will. It would seem, and then I'll give it to Javier. It would seem like a way I've thought about it, and I think it ties into the ontoepistemology point that we've been made, where now it's kind of ontoepistemology. Like if modernism, and it's almost like you can view modernism as a world where subject and object are divided, and postmodernism is a reaction against that says, oh, truth defined as a division of subject from object, or theory from practice, AA, all of this, that doesn't work. And if you mean by truth something like that, we need to get over it, because what you end up doing is that's going to be captured by the system that's going to conform subjects to it, right? And there's almost a way in which, funny enough, maybe the grind, like if you're still operating in a subject system, or Cadell's new book, Subject Systems, where the system and the subject are separate, whereas in Hegel, you have a mixture of theory and practice, subject system, object subject, the divide is closed. And that would be the counter-enlightenment move, where you're not dealing with ontology and epistemology, you're always dealing with ontoepistemology. And in fact, you always were, even when you didn't think you were. And that's the problem. Modernism and the mistake of modernism, if you follow my autonomous rationality, is believing you could separate those things. And then postmodernity comes along and correctly says you can't, but instead of going, you need an ontoepistemology, it ends up just a critique that basically will end in a Richard Rorty saying, capital T truth needs to go on vacation, which then I think Professor Edmondson out of UVA, who the poetry professor, he did a really good piece recently to say, yeah, if capital T truth goes on vacation, you can't stop mobs, political extremism, you can't stop all of these things that have happened today, right? Because pragmatism can't do much for that. So then it's like, oh, go back to counter-modernity. So there's a way, when you look at Foucault and Derrida as a critique of the modernist project, that's a very good thing. But the problem is, if you don't have the knowledge of, say, what I keep calling the counter-enlightenment movement, the modern counter-enlightenment movement, where ontology and epistemology go together, you can't erase truth in favor of what I call the absolute, which would be Hegelian, which is the blending of ontology and epistemology. All you have is the getting rid of truth, and then all you have is pragmatism. And then in that void, if you will, people still feel a desire to get something like truth. And where do they get it, though? It's almost what like ends up happening in the grind culture is like, okay, the system never sleeps, so I'm never going to sleep either. I'll be like the system, because I'm going to close there's like a subconscious understanding you need to close the subject-object divide. But you see in the counter-enlightenment that you don't close it. It was never there. A very slight difference that makes a big difference. Like following Hegel, there never was a subject-object, or even Heidegger, there's not a subject-object divide. But today what we end up doing is we're trying to close a divide that's not there by being like the system, or letting the AI replace us, per se, closing the divide, which then creates all these very strange pathological responses in that way. So there seems to be a very big difference between coming to realize the divide was never there, thus subject and object, thus absolute, versus trying to close the divide, ergo save truth, which doesn't exist, so you end up with something pathological. And of course, when we use truth, we're using it in a special sense, and it would depend what conversation you're in, and so on and so forth. So that problem seems to be lurking here as well. But Chetan, please.
I'll just quickly say this. I'm not sure, how much traction I would have in that sense. But if you see these philosophers, particularly for Foucault never said I'm a postmodernist in that sense. He never actually. And more so, it's not even true that Foucault doesn't have an idea of truth in that sense. To simply say Foucault dismissing truth might, he has a very particular analysis of the problem of truth, which I said it was something to do with, this addiction to truth, this obsession with truth in that sense. But he used to talk about subjugated knowledges, local knowledges, and he saw truth sort of emerging in those contexts. He had a whole, I think, seminar, I think in one of his last seminars, The Will to Truth, if I remember correctly, on that specific question of truth. Similarly, let's say Derrida, I remember attending a very early philosophy class, maybe a decade back, where my professor sort of comes to the class and he sort of openly, to introduce Derrida, he says, deconstruction is decentering of meaning, there is no truth. And, he goes on like 2 minutes upon that kind of a rant. And he says, oh, no. There's a problem in what I'm saying. And then everybody sort of responds back and he says, Derrida's problem is not that meaning gets decentered. That is obvious. But Derrida does an obvious thing. Derrida's problem is, if meaning gets decentered, how do you recognize an object? It's a different question. And unless we bring that nuance to these discussions in that sense, unless we sort of sometimes think that, these discussions are happening in some polar binaries out in that, spectrum in that sense. But when you start reading these thinkers closely, you start realizing that what is at stake in these discussions is, I think, much bigger than truth or no truth binary in that sense. When you reduce it to that binary, I think you get answers which may be right, but they're also repetitive. They're also giving you back some kind of common sense in that sense, rather than good sense of Deleuze in that, So I think that's one point that I wanted to sort of, But I think it's much more interesting to just to sort of 1 minute more, just to sort of think about, if we want to think about this problem of truth and an obsession with it in some senses, I think a good way to think about it is that once you make power more and more indirect, it's almost like a balloon. Once you make power indirect, the nature of or its linkages with truth also starts increasing. Am I right? In some senses. That more indirect a power becomes. So if I have to directly kill you, even that involves certain kind of relationship to knowledge, how to do it, where to cut, which knife to use, so on and so forth. Those are all for Foucault forms of knowledge in that sense. But the more I have to act that power out on your soul rather than on your body, the more I'm dependent upon truth and knowledge to do that. And this problem for Foucault is something we can't escape. It's almost like this idea that the more one gets inflated, the more other gets inflated also. The more power gets indirect, the more this side becomes. And what do we do with it? In a very concrete problem. Then how do we organize our power such that it doesn't get completely intermingled or meshed with or completely collapses into truth? That's the kind of question I think Foucault is trying to raise. And to answer that, I think it demands much more,
Oh, no, excellent. I think it's very important to compare the early Foucault with the later Foucault. They're very different. I think Derrida says, deconstruction is about justice. And his notion of deconstruction is obviously tied to Heidegger's clearing, right? I mean, it's like there's a way of Derrida being a he's very much playing on notions of clearing and Heidegger. And so it's the problem of so for example, for me, you can easily read a Foucault and a Derrida as going, we took a wrong turn somewhere. This project that's been going on doesn't work. But since, as I keep saying, Mr. Luber brought up Owen Barfield, who's a hyper genius, and him and Rudolf Steiner and all these people who want to be talking about how the subject and the object are participating in a creative act, very Hegelian. That line of thought was completely ignored for the last 120 years. So when Derrida and these people are pointing out problems, since we don't have those resources, all we can do is interpret them as saying something nihilistic, because we don't have categories to say, wait, no, there's a possibility of the absolute, even if the truth doesn't work as a project. Well, we don't have those resources. So what ends up happening is because we ignored those resources. So what we end up doing is interpreting a lot of the postmodernists as leaving us in a nihilistic place. Don't get me wrong. There are nihilistic postmodernists and there are deconstructionists who do that. But as we know, usually the original thinker tends up more nuanced than the followers, right? It's just like the difference between Plato and Platonists, or I've been reading a lot on Immanuel Kant and being awoken to Mr. Conant's understanding of Kant, where he's got that paper where he says Kant isn't a Kantian, and Joel sent me that, and it's I guess I have to reread everyone. So it's fascinating, because then Kantianism, they're making an argument that doesn't resemble Kant. What? What do you do with that? And you read everyone again twice or 3 times, or never stop, I guess. And you keep going. But by not having the category of the absolute, then we can only understand a critique of the truth as leading us in utter relativism, power, nihilism, and hopelessness, or whatever. And once that occurs, then people are left in existential conditions to live with that reality, and then you get grind culture, then you get escapism, then you get entertainment, that like it makes them vulnerable to all of these things that we are describing, because what else do you do, right? And that can form, because the thing I'm interested in, and as we come to the close here, if anyone has final things to say, please. I'm really interested too, and I guess it's like for me a litmus test of all this. So the whole idea, and I've heard Peter Kreeft say this, the whole idea of like technology was supposed to save us time, right? Like your time was supposed to be saved with these new technologies. Why is it that it feels like we have less time than ever before with these time-saving technologies, right? To me, that says something, because what it does, and it's also like, I almost feel like when like there's something about like when you had to go to work and you didn't have the option of working at home, you almost were like, because you were forced to work, it was easier not to work as much. But when you have your free time and you choose not to work, then you know you're not working and you feel bad about yourself and know you should be doing more. So there's something weird going on to, as humans are given more time, they are more prone to use that time to take it from themselves, like to do a work so where they're always busy. Why is that? Well, I think to Javier's video, that's evidence of a wrong onto-epistemology. Like you don't have the ability to like use the time, because basically, if in order to not end up in perpetual work, you have to experience free time, feel the thought of I could be productive right now, and resist it. You know, right? Like the thought has to enter your head. You could answer an email and you have to resist it. Okay. Why would you resist it if your entire life you've been told that it's ethical to work more? It's always ethical to work more. Like you have a value system that leaves you unequipped, right? To resist that thought of working more, right? But then if you say, no, I'm not going to work more, if everyone else is around you doing it, you almost have to be saying that they're doing something wrong and you don't want to be mean. And no, maybe I'll just go in and, hey, maybe it will be good because I'll answer this email and get a new promotion and make more money. Maybe it will be good. Well, now you're thinking about tomorrow in the way Kierkegaard warned about, right? And so there's something that's happening here where as people are getting more time, they feel like they have less time. And why exactly is that? What is occurring in people's free time that are compelling them on their own to use that time against themselves almost, right? This is a very curious dynamic that seems to be where a lot of these movements of thought have left us because we don't have the resources of an onto-epistemology or something. And it's a curious thing to me. It's a curious thing, but please, anyone have final thoughts, please? Mr. Luber, yes.
So just to tie in Owen Barfield, because I completely agree with you, he's freaking genius. And also to tie in Heidegger, because to me they're very similar. This is the problem of withdrawal. So Owen Barfield, he talks heavily about semantics, and basically when you think about things in terms of semantics, you have the semantic itself and then the semantics in the world. It plays out in the world differently than the semantic itself. So to tie in Heidegger, the withdrawal element is withdrawing from the actual, either from the semantic itself or the worldly quality of the semantic, and basically withdrawing back to the other end and then coming back to the opposite, so to speak. So for me, like, I completely agree with the whole onto-epistemological issue, but for the everyday person, I think like Barfield's language is quite fruitful because you could just say simply that there's the semantic of what you're saying and then the actual experience of the semantic playing out. And I think that is very, you can really visualize that very easily. And then the whole concept of withdrawal from a semantic framework is just simply withdrawing from one pole, so to speak, to the other of the semantic. So I just kind of wanted to, say that. And then once you kind of look at it from that viewpoint, you kind of, and I'm obviously biased with storytelling, but when you look at worldviews under semantic framework, It's very easy to withdraw in and out. It's very easy to access time in the sense that you don't feel like you have none because you're able to withdraw from the idea of what you're doing to the actual doing of what you're doing, so to speak. So I just think that is what storytelling is. Like you have your theme, you go into it thinking of the semantic itself, so to speak, and then once you're in the story and it's unfolding, there's always the possibility of the theme, so to speak, changing or adapting due to the unfolding of the actual story. But that in order to do that and like not have writer's block, you have to have that ability to withdraw from either the thematic disposition that you're in or the story's disposition that you're in. So yeah, this was a freaking great conversation. And by the way, Daniel, when's your book? When can I buy it? Because I feel like a lot of these answers, it's like belonging again. It's like, how can I belong to myself is ultimately the project. Like society, myself, it's everything. So I feel like this ties into everything.
Well, first off, I was having a wonderful conversation with Mr. Flores the other night about how the key is that the object cannot be accessed. So we're never going to make belonging again accessible so that people want it more and more. And then we're just going to open it for 5 minutes and it will be for $500 and people will buy it. And then we're going to send we're going to go on vacation. So we're working on that. So we will see. Mr. Flores, good to see you, sir. And I'll give it to Javier as we come up at the end. But I've got some, because I think this topic. So what's interesting is on your point there, Andrew, it's almost as if as you gain more time, the consequences of not realizing there's a certain story structure to how reality unfolds to you will, as a result, make you use the technology in a manner that makes the correct story seem as if you should be using your time more. Like the literal use of the time transforms the sculpture that unfolds and the theme becomes working more. And therefore, reality discloses at a place where you should be working more, right? Because you don't have an understanding of this metaphysics of story, if you will. So you trap yourself, you enclose yourself in that, right? And then why would you ever think it's wrong? In fact, anyone who would suggest it's wrong is an a-hole, right? That's the problem of the meta dimension, right? Likewise, if you don't have the notion of like Lacan or different things, as you're doing that, if someone says, hey, you're doing all this Lacan stuff, you're like, a-hole, no, I'm not. So you like not having that meta ability, that AB ability, as we've talked about before, is extremely consequential because you have no ability to analyze what you are operating in, as you're saying, like a story metaphysic or different thing, or maybe in Lacan, it's a denial of lack, right? That in the operation that you're going, well, you can never see yourself within that structure to begin to withdraw from it, right? And that seems to be part of what's going on. Because Mr. Flores, we were asking this weird question of why is it as everyone gets technology that saves them time, supposed to save them time, it feels like no one has time. Like it's like this weird thing that's kind of occurring, right? And it opens to different things. So Javier, I hope you have not failed your paper now. Okay, I believe you're going to get a good grade on that paper that's due in like 30 minutes or whatever, right? I think it's going to work. So let me get to Javier and then Chetan.
So yeah, there's been a couple of concepts that I've been working out. One is my two favorites: Slack emergent relationships and excess emergent relationships. I actually think grind culture is actually predicated on the lack emergent relationship, meaning that the very discourse that you participate dictates the lack for the subject, meaning that we're always thinking, okay, more work, more do this. I don't have enough time. I need more time. So there's always this sort of, the discourse is already dictating to you the lack that you need to do to grind, right? But the excess emergent relationship is the very fact that, kind of like Kierkegaard's focus on today, we ignore the emergent reality that faces us because of the tension of the lack emergent relationship, meaning that I have today off, right? But I'm worrying about tomorrow. Like the whole excess of today is completely null and void because I'm looking at tomorrow. Because I'm thinking about the next thing I need to do to get the good life, to get the American dream, to be happy, and so on. So the discourse already dictates to the subject what it lacks Or let me put it this way, the discourse already makes it so the subject goes, oh, I'm lacking something, and then keeps going, keeps grinding. So I'm kind of inversing. I'm not sticking with the Lacanian notion of lack here. But the excess itself, that is what is basically avoided. And I think ideology is what, and I think Chetan said it, like, it's ideology, man. It's ideology that feeds that sort of lack emergent relationship that continues us to perpetuate and null the emergent relationship. And this is very similar to like Buber's understanding, where it's like most of us aren't really actually having a conversation. We're extracting. So extracting is already the notion of lacking. If you're extracting, you can't ever, you're always actually never interacting with a person. You're interacting with an object to attain your very satisfaction. So in this case, all beliefs, all criteria is sort of based on this fact. There's a lack of emergence. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Very nice, Javier. I'll give it to Chetan and Mr. Flores. And now I'm wondering, is there it's almost like we treat time to extract it. Is it something where we need to learn to have a conversation with time, to use that language that you're saying? Like, we don't know how to converse with time, only how to extract time. So let me give it to Chetan.
It's actually extremely interesting, the question that you raised, Daniel, and which is basically, if you think about politics was always linked to free time. You go back to Greek culture in that sense, if you don't have free time, you are not somebody who can participate in the public sphere. Right? And the idea is that the more you are bound to your necessities, the more outside the political sphere you exist. When primarily three categories that Aristotle used was women, children, and slaves. Right? In that sense, it's not because women are inferior in that sense. That is why they're not. The reason for they're not part, because they are more linked to the necessities. And the idea is that more free time. And you are absolutely right that at some space the hope was that as you will get you get more technology, and you would create a situation where everybody can participate in the political sphere, the public sphere, in that sense of Hannah Arendt, the political sphere, because we all would have more time. We would be free from our necessities. What has interestingly happened is the reverse one. What has happened is that we have bound everybody by our necessities. And that has been done through technology. It is in that context that we don't have time. And I think that the situation is also reversed in some senses. It's not like we don't have time, so we are not. That's not true. I think because we are bound by necessities such that we cannot have time. Time is something which frees you from your necessities, isn't it? Time always had that function that it could free you from, being bound to your biological life for survival. And that is why Foucault's biopolitics is the question of how do you bring life itself to the center of politics? How do you bring survival itself to the center of politics? So on one hand, we have a culture which is in some senses the most advanced than ever we were in technological terms and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we have a culture who's more obsessed with survival necessity than we ever were before. How do you find these two things coming simultaneously together? And it's not a coincidence that they are together. One is the causing the other in many ways, which is extremely difficult to think in that sense. And I'll just sort of briefly, and then I'll just leave after this, that this question of anxiety is extremely important, I think. And I myself, I haven't thought through that problem in that sense. And I've not read Kierkegaard in any detail. But anxiety, sometimes it's interesting to think about these concepts from a certain practitioner's perspectives, rather than and anxiety becomes very, very obscure theoretical the minute you start entering into its theory in some senses. So, from a practitioner's perspective, anxiety is always linked to some unanswered libidoral energy. Am I right? A libidoral energy that can't find its object in some senses, which is why Freud had a discussion whether that it is objectless and Lacan comes with object petita, something this is object petita, those kind of trajectories theoretically that we had. But essentially, it was always a problem of a desire it doesn't have an object. And then you can find theories built upon that. It was always linked to a certain form of libidinal excess, which cannot find its object in that sense. When something gets repressed, and its excess of effect remains over there. That effect always causes anxiety because it is not able to find its own, relationship back to object. So if you're a practitioner of some sort, you'd always struggle with anxiety in this context with the patient, and then you start thinking theoretically beyond that. So I'm just trying to reduce the theory down to the minimal in that sense. But if you think about anxiety in this sense, this idea of a desire which can't find an object, which is why anxiety is the most honest emotion in that, as like Zizek would say it. Because it can't lie to you because it doesn't have an object to lie in that sense. It's always something which comes through in that manner. I think it's extremely interesting what kinds of inroads anxiety has sort of carved for us in our I don't think anxiety ever had this kind of a space in our public imagination and daily life as it exists now. So what is at stake over here is that on one side we have so many technological objects technical objects that exist around us. On the other side, we do not have the capacity to sustain a desire to the point that it can attain it can find its own goal. In fact, desires are being stripped of their own goals in that sense, consistently, which is how they get reduced to drives, isn't it? And it is in that structuring that you find anxiety emerging as this complete mass phenomenon which doesn't have. And anxieties are extremely lonely things, that is why, because desire has an object in the world. Anxiety makes you lonely. Anxiety makes you feel completely trapped into your own being because you can't have an object in that. And there's something about authoritarianism that you're moving into, which is linked to this kind of a structure. And I'm afraid so. Yeah. Thanks.
Excellent. I'll pass to Mr. Flores and Dimitri now. And it's a good thing anxiety doesn't lie because, whoa, if anxiety lied, then we'd be really anxious. So it's really good we can trust in that. Now I'm wondering if we're like, oh man, AI is going to take our jobs. We're going to have nothing to do. What if it's the exact opposite? What if AI somehow gives us tons of work and we have zero time because we all thought computers and everything would save our time and nope, didn't. What if AI pulls a fast one as well? Oh gosh. I think we lost Mr. Flores there on the bus. So let me pass it to Dimitri here.
Chetan, am I correct to say that you said anxiety doesn't have an object? Or would you say it does?
I'm not saying it doesn't have an object. Of course,
Okay.
when you get into object petit I and those kind of discussions, you'll enter into this issue of, the other being there, and the anxiety becomes this root of when you do not know the other wants from you in that sense. So in that sense, it has an object.
Yeah.
In that sense, it has an object. But that those theoretical movements only come from when Freud recognized that it doesn't have an object like a desire would have.
Right.
That's the starting point of that problem, which is, I said, it's interesting to think of it from a practitioner's perspective. Then you start entering into these theoretical structures. But originally, when Freud recognized that problem, for Freud, the problem was that anxiety always exists at the point when desire loses its object in that sense.
Right.
That's how Freud started thinking about it. And that's how you experience it also. It's only when you understand that experience, you understand that there's an other over there through which you are, trying to locate your own desire and so on and so forth.
So,
right?
Would you say that that desire as such is like a defense against anxiety?
It can be, yeah. At least that's how Freud was thinking about it. When you can retrace it, but problem is that desire being a defense against anxiety only is a posthumous thinking. It's something like in psychoanalysis when you say that remembering is a defense against illness. So remembering is an outcome of when you are able to heal the illness you remember. But you can't focus upon remember and heal the patient. You can't tell the patient, remember this, and the patient will get healed. That will not happen. But when the patient remembers, the healing does take place. Similarly, in anxiety also, when you're able to find your desire back, you do get healed. But I can't give you the desire. That's not the way to think about it. In that sense, that's more an outcome of the healing process rather than the process to heal. In that sense, if when anxiety gets released, you do find your desire back. That does happen.
it's almost like you have desire before anxiety and then desire on the other side of anxiety in some kind of respect. And that makes me think, we've talked before about intrinsic motivation. You start as a child, go on the journey, then you can have the intrinsic in these kind of different formations. But let me pass it, unless you have more to say, Dimitri. I don't mean to cut you off. Okay,
I want to see what
yes, Mr. Flores, good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well.
Oh yeah, I'm doing really well. Sorry for that cut off because I'm on the train right now. I just landed in San Diego, so I just wanted to pop in. Yeah, visiting family, so I just wanted to pop in and say hi and see how everybody's doing. But no, I like what's going on, and I think I want to like kind of tie it in with what Chetan was saying about anxiety. And it was really good that he brought up like the clinical stuff because that's what I'm focusing on in the seminars. But like to bring it into more of understanding how, you know, the issue of like technology and time and politics. It's that, you know, the rise of technology, the algorithm allows for the space for more time. Or as my friend Dave from Theory Underground, he's got his book Time Energy, or it's Waypoint, but he's working on another one called Time Energy. So it's based on the whole notion of like Heidegger's being in time. In a sense, it does have an ontological existential structure to it, but we don't have time energy as he says it in one word. This would be like his objet petit a, or like the sort of jouissance, the lack of not having, which is constitutive, not even just constitutive to a certain discourse. It's just part of what makes the subject a subject, a lack, a split. And now we see how capitalism has destroyed the other as the master, right? As Lacan says, you know, we have there is no big other. We realized, and Zizek talks about this, and for they know not what they do. Thus, in flipping Dostoevsky's notion of if God doesn't exist and all is permitted, no, it's precisely that God doesn't exist, that nothing is permitted. And yet this causes a social anxiety with consequences. And in the sense of not only politics, but the rise of technology, it's that we're filled with so much anxiety, yet we don't have the ability to even have time energy. We have the ability to have relative time energy due to maybe things being done at home now due to post-COVID. People would rather stay at home and do work. They have these abilities to do that, and yet they don't have the time energy itself to be able to do the things they want to do, because their desire is still caught in this mourning for an other, right? And this was where we get into like a collective mourning and melancholia, or even perversion, in which there's a cruelty that we put onto us. We undermine ourselves. That's how our drive. And I was speaking more socially, not as much as in the clinic, but someone like Matthew Fleecefader and Dwayne Roussel talk about that. Matthew Fleecefader talks more about the algorithm of desire and how, though technology has the multiple things that it could do to help us, the algorithm actually entraps us into codes of desire and conditioning our fantasy, conditioning our desire, and thus trying to fulfill lack. And it doesn't do that. It just constantly creates this repetition compulsion of trying to find enjoyment in that. And so, I mean, that's just all I wanted to add to that. Is I found it quite interesting. But Dave's notion of time energy is like, well, we need to find a way where we can have the ability to have more relative time energy, which is time hyphen energy, to be able to do the things like write, read, do philosophy, hang out with the family, you know, enjoy that quality time while not being obfuscated or captured by the domination of the capitalist reproduction of just creating commodification, constantly saying, oh, you need this, you must have this, and therefore you also must enjoy it, because that's a super ego's injunction to enjoy, and thus never being fulfilled.
Excellent, Mr. Flores. And it's very clear that you are in San Diego, because everything behind you looks like a desktop, like a laptop background. Like everything I'm saying, like that could be the background of a desktop. That could be the background of a desktop. I very much, like you say, a few things. Chetan, I meant to note, I really like what you were saying on the political ramifications, like what it would mean, how it kind of fits in we don't have time, so we can't be politically involved. I think that I really do like everyone. Theory Underground is an incredible channel. The work that they do is very important. And the readings that Andrew and Nick have been doing on Lacan are stupidly deep and profound and well done. So well done to you, sure, because the seminars of Lacan are not easy texts. I think I'd rather read Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce sometimes. So that's very difficult. So well done to you. And I like time energy. Coming to the close, I fear I will have to run because I have work that wants to take my time energy. Okay, dang it. But luckily the AI is going to make me have less time, actually, somehow. I don't know. But it's interesting because time energy seems to be more of an onto-epistemological term as opposed to time and energy. That would be separating. So there's something there that's more onto. That's interesting to me. Javier, you have no excuse to fail your paper now. Zero. So you better do well. And the last thing I'll say, it makes me think, I always did prefer T.S. Eliot's The Four Quartets to The Wasteland. And he begins Bert Norton with this kind of issue where there are all these layers of times. He's going through the ruins of Bert Norton. And he has flashes where a bird is singing where he says, you know, humanity has never been able to take too much reality. But of course, birds do not speak. So how is this bird speaking? Well, what's happening is he looks down into the ruins of the well and it's empty, and he refers to the sunlight filling the well with water, but that's of course not possible. What's happening is he's having a memory of being a child when he was playing in the garden with the other kids, and the well was filled there. So when he has the time layers fall together, he experiences it today as if the sunlight is filling the water. So he's not able to bring time together in his memories. He's existing in all time at the same time. And T.S. Eliot is one making the point that this is the human condition, that we always actually exist between many layers. And we have to get to the place where we return to our beginnings, which is to realize that we're always a mixture of these layers and competing sort of notions, and somehow learn to integrate them together. Or else we will be in a state of trying to run from that reality because it is too mentally difficult to try to organize in our own head. Ergo, we make ourselves always busy on our phone. Ergo, we enter into a grind culture. Ergo, we run from ourselves because the work of figuring out how to integrate ourselves as a subject is quite difficult. The final image of the Four Quartets in The Little Gidding, where he talks about the return to our place of our beginning so we know it for the first time, which I always associate with Hegel's absolute knowing because you realize the always already. And very much of life seems to be an ability to return to something that you already knew so that you could actually know it anew. It's interesting how the Bible will emphasize making all things new. It's the things that are always there anew. And there's something about that anew with the A in parentheses that seems very important. The final image of Little Gidding is that the fire and the rose are one, and neither are consumed. And it would seem that the name of the game today is for us to all somehow be roses that are consumed by a fire that could make us miserable and blazing and not able to handle ourselves because it's sex. Or if we can learn not to be consumed by the fire, we could be a kind of miracle, a new kind of burning bush, if you were, which would be a rose where the fire and the rose are one and neither is consumed. And it would seem that the challenge of the subject today is to somehow be a personification of that image that we see in T.S. Eliot. So I believe that might be our challenge today. But with that, I fear I'm going to go have my time energy taken. Javier's going to pass a paper. He better friggin' pass that paper.